All right, welcome to asynchronous class. We just left off, and so I want to record these things so you can watch them on Wednesday, whatever your schedule is, and you can work your schedule around several of the Day of Common Learning events. So let's get to it. I left off the last lecture with this question. Why were there two of these 24 names that we have right here? Here you have 18 actually, but there were 24 I believe on the place I originally got it from. Two of those 24 across all fields of science were crystallographers. Why was that? There's a different poster that has a more recent edition that we have. The 2015 Nobel Prize was awarded to Tu Youyou, and she was actually the first woman from China to receive a Nobel Prize. She was more of a pharmacologist, but she did work with protein structure as pharmacologists do now. And her work led to a small molecule drug for malaria. So I just want to say there's a lot of women who are trailblazers in science. We've already talked about Franklin, but I want to talk about Hodgkin. When we talk about Dorothy Crowfoot Hodgkin, we're actually not just talking about one structure. She was involved with three very important structures, any one of which would have been a huge accomplishment. Penicillin, the structure of penicillin, and you see how the structures get more complex over time. Then vitamin B12 was figured out by her, and then insulin. We've already shown insulin in the class. It is a small protein. It's made as one chain, it's cut up into two chains, and then it comes together as 6 chains. But all this is to be, it's a very important protein, but it took until 1969, and it was one of the things that she contributed. Hodgkin also contributed to politics, and so there's this interesting article about Cold War science, and it mentions Hodgkin. Let's see where she is here. There was a talk. Oh yes, it shows the picture of her. There she is talking to a Soviet physicist in 1983. And if you know about 1983, this just didn't happen, except in science, where you could have prominent scientists who were talking to each other. She used that as part of the sense. She actually used that to argue for peace with Russia at the time. And so I think it's very interesting. I don't know many of the details about exactly how this works out, but there were these overtones at the time, and she wasn't just involved with crystallography, she was also involved in politics, and she was very good at dealing with all of the complexities of these different areas. So there's an article about this that's titled Women in Crystallography. It points out particularly that Dorothy Hodgkin and Rosalind Franklin played key parts in finding several of the structures that we now have in our textbooks. And so one of the early stories about Hodgkin is she actually started off in crystallography because her parents were archaeologists. She tells a story about how one of the first things she did is that she would help them out with their research by illustrating floor tilings that they were studying. These floor tilings are repeated, they're basically two-dimensional crystals on the floor. That got her to understand how symmetry works in a crystalline sort of situation, and that prepared her for work as a crystallographer with the mathematical representation of those symmetry operations. All that is to say, you never know what's going to become useful as a scientist as you go through. It could even be that studying floor tiles sets someone on the path to discovering the structure of insulin. This shows you that she was involved with politics and archaeology. She was actually also involved with areas of art, including that her drawings themselves were rather artistic. I just look at this. This is like a topo map of insulin that she drew. And you see how it's aesthetically pleasing. She must have noticed it as well. And you can see the hexameric structure. By the way, I said that insulin comes together as 6 chains, right? You see that in the flower-like arrangement of the 6 petals that you see here. Well, it turns out that Dorothy Hodgkin saw the same thing, and she was in contact with some artists and designers who were making wallpaper. And they took some of these designs of the insulin electronic structure and they put it onto the wallpaper as a modified design. they sometimes modified design a little bit more. This is more of an abstract art type thing, but it was still inspired by the same thing. The big thing in the middle, by the way, is the metal that's holding it all together. And so I found out about this by chance. I was actually wandering around in London, and I saw the Wellcome Center, which I knew funded science, and then I saw that they had an exhibition. And so it's called From Atoms to Patterns. And so I went in and I found out about all these things I had never learned before. And Dorothy Hodgkin was one of the main parts of the exhibition. She connected her scientific work to patterns of fabric and wallpaper. It's like here, right here, is another example of fabric patterns here. And I believe that is these are all either myoglobin or hemoglobin. If you see a square, I believe it's myoglobin. If you see the hexagon, it's insulin. And so this was the exhibition of science was actually influenced by this combination of science and art. And you can see on the walls some of the wallpaper and design elements that brought science and art together there. One of the restaurants at the time, I think this was one of the fancy restaurants in the South Bank in London, they actually put up this insulin wallpaper on their walls. And so you could actually be eating underneath the pattern of insulin that was being produced by your body in response to the sugars that you're eating at that point. Kind of a biochemical artistic situation. If they had thought of it, they would have called that whole experience an artistic endeavor. But as it was just cool to be working under wallpaper that was insulin. Most people probably just thought it was pretty, you know? And they even made plates that had things like these, some of these structures on them. Some of these are mineral crystallography, but some of them are protein crystallography. And the first scientist to really to really figure out a lot of the things about crystallography was Sir Lawrence Bragg. His wife was therefore Lady Alice Bragg. And when they had the International Union of Crystallography meeting, she wore an evening dress made of the Burl 8.9 crystal structure in some way was represented on that dress. So they actually even did things like making hemoglobin, putting that on lace. And so it's kind of weird, but yeah, the hemoglobin lace is a possibility. And that is why women were in crystallography. I guess I should answer the main question that we have. Women were a major part of crystallography because they weren't locked into the usual development pattern, because certain opportunities, the best opportunities, were blocked off to them. And yet you have a woman like Dorothy Hodgkin who's able to take the pieces of possibilities that she has and to synthesize it. Because they were sort of out of the mainstream, they were able to make friends in other areas, and they saw that these connections could not just contribute to the other areas, but they could help science work better as well. I think you could really argue that Hodgkin was a brilliant scientist and did a lot of things that the other male scientists did not at the time, possibly because she was brought up by two archaeologists, because she had a different path. So, all that is to say, life lesson, right? Your path can be different than other people's, but the main thing is, how are you putting it all together? And you can put together surprising experiences into something that can turn into a Nobel Prize, in the case of Hodgkin. So that is the lesson for today. Let's call that a day for this one, and we'll move on to the next lecture.